the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
It feels like everywhere you turn nowadays, political opinions are like right there on the surface, amplified, scrutinized, sometimes even weaponized.
It's true.
It makes you wonder, though, right? Like how this whole charged atmosphere we're living in might actually be like influencing actions in the real world.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to be diving into today. We've got this story about an alleged vandalism incident at a Tesla dealership, and the details are, well, they're definitely raising some eyebrows.
Definitely.
So our source material today is an article from American Wire News.
Okay.
And it paints a pretty vivid picture. I'm talking Molotov cocktails, spray paint, and even messages like Nazi cars scrawled all over, like these shiny new vehicles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it all happened at a dealership in Loveland, Colorado. Honestly, it sounds like something straight out of a movie.
I see that.
Now, the alleged perpetrator is someone the article identifies as Lucy Grace Nelson, a 42-year-old transgender woman. And she was arrested with materials for making Molotov cocktails. So this isn't just kids messing around.
Okay.
Police are taking this very seriously. The article also dives into some background on Nelson. It cites her father, who claims she's been struggling with emotional problems and hasn't had stable employment.
Yeah.
He also mentioned that the family leans Democrat and isn't exactly a fan of the current president.
Okay.
But he insists that his child has no history of radical behavior, so it's starting to sound like a pretty complicated situation.
Yeah.
Right. And it gets even more intriguing when you factor in Nelson's presence on social media. So the article highlights some posts where she refers to herself as baby, talks about like first bra and first dress experiences, that kind of thing. And they also mention a deactivated Reddit account that they say is attributed to Nelson. There's a statement there. All bigots should be killed, although it adds, don't actually, because going to prison sucks. I'm curious to hear your take on all this. What do you think?
Well, it's definitely a story with a lot of layers, and the way American Wire News is presenting this information is, I think it's worth examining. The language is very strong. you know, and it seems to really emphasize certain aspects of Nelson's identity. For instance, repeatedly calling her a man who considers himself a woman, or using phrases like dress-wearing man.
Wow.
I mean, these could be seen as framing techniques.
Framing techniques. Could you maybe explain what you mean by that for our listeners? I think that's a really important concept to unpack here.
Sure. Think of it like a photographer. They're choosing how to compose a shot. Right?
Yeah.
They decide what to include in the frame, what to leave out, and how to position things to create a certain effect.
Yeah.
So similarly, the way a news outlet presents information, like the words they choose, the details they emphasize, it all contributes to shaping the reader's perception of the event, of the people involved, the whole thing.
That makes a lot of sense. So in this case, you're saying the article might be subtly trying to influence how we view Nelson and her actions.
Exactly. And it's not just the language used to describe her. The article also brings in a very specific political context.
Okay.
They mention President Trump potentially labeling these attacks as domestic terrorism.
Sure.
And they quote Attorney General Pam Bondi, who is taking a very strong stance on prosecuting those involved.
Oh, I see what you mean. They're connecting this incident to the larger political landscape, which could, I guess, lead readers to make certain assumptions about Nelson's motivations.
Right. And that raises a really important question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we interpret individual actions in such a politically charged environment?
Yeah.
Are we too quick to jump to conclusions, especially when there are biases or, pre-existing narratives at play?
Yeah, it's like everyone's trying to fit this incident into their own political framework, whether it actually fits or not. And the American Wire News article isn't exactly discouraging that.
Precisely. And that's where critical thinking becomes so crucial.
Yeah.
It's easy to get swept up in the narrative, especially when it confirms our existing beliefs.
Right.
But we need to be careful about forming judgments based on limited information and potentially biased presentations.
Well said. And there's another layer to this story that I found particularly interesting. The article mentions that Elon Musk, himself pointed fingers at 5 groups that are funded through ActBlue, which is the Democratic Party's fundraising platform. He suggests that, like, they could be behind similar attacks. Almost feels like he's trying to paint a target on their backs, doesn't it?
It definitely adds fuel to the fire, so to speak, and it highlights how quickly these types of incidents can become politicized even before, like, all the facts are known.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, you have Nelson's father, who's stating that, the family leans Democrat, has reasons to dislike the current president, while also claiming his child has no history of radical behavior.
Right.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with, like, half the pieces missing.
Exactly. And that's a perfect illustration of why we need to be cautious about drawing conclusions based on incomplete information.
Like, we don't have the full picture yet.
Right.
It's important to acknowledge that.
It seems like we're often presented with these like really simplified narratives that pit one side against the other, and it can be so difficult to see beyond those narratives, It's almost like we're living in echo chambers, constantly bombarded with information that just reinforces what we already believe.
That's a great point. Yeah, we tend to gravitate towards information that confirms our biases, and social media algorithms often exacerbate this tendency.
Right.
They feed us more of what we already agree with, creating these echo chambers where dissenting voices are rarely even heard.
Yeah, and it's not just social media, right?
Yeah.
Think about the news we consume. It often feels like we're choosing sides. Fox News versus CNN, MSNBC versus Breitbart. It's all very polarized.
Absolutely. And that polarization can make it so difficult to have nuanced conversations about these really complex issues. It creates this us versus them mentality where compromise and understanding become almost impossible.
So how do we break out of these echo chambers? Right. How do we start seeing things more objectively and engaging in more productive conversations? It feels like such a daunting task.
It is a challenge, but it starts with, I think, acknowledging our own biases.
Okay.
We all have them. Like, they're based on our experiences, upbringing, the information we've been exposed to. The key is to recognize those biases and try to view information through a more critical lens.
So instead of just like accepting information that aligns with our views, we should actively seek out alternative perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about exposing ourselves to diverse viewpoints and like really trying to understand where people are coming from, even if we disagree with them.
And maybe that means like stepping outside of our usual news sources, having conversations with people who hold different political views, and being more willing to question our own assumptions.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that the world is complex, and there are rarely simple answers to these really complex questions.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. And I think it applies directly back to this Tesla vandalism case. Like, it would be easy to just jump to conclusions about Nelson's motivations based on her social media posts or the political climate. But it's important to remember that we don't have all the facts.
Absolutely. There could be underlying mental health issues, personal struggles, a multitude of other factors that contributed to this incident. We need to be really careful about attributing everything to political motivations.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to approach these situations with maybe a bit more empathy and a lot less judgment.
I agree.
And to remember that everyone has a story, even those whose actions we might not understand or condone.
Well said. And speaking of stories, the media plays such a powerful role in shaping how we perceive events like this one.
Yeah, it feels like we're constantly just bombarded with information these days, and it can be so hard to sort through it all, figure out what's real, what's spin, what's just speculation.
It's true. We live in this age of information overload, and with that comes this huge responsibility to be discerning consumers of news and media.
Yeah, thinking back to those framing techniques you mentioned earlier, it seems like the way a story is presented can really influence how we interpret it. It's almost like we're being nudged towards a certain conclusion, even if we don't realize it.
Absolutely, yeah. Media outlets have a lot of power in shaping public opinion. They choose what to report on, what angle to take, what language to use, and all those choices can have a really significant impact on how we view events, the people involved, everything.
So what can we do about it? How can we be more aware of these framing techniques and avoid being manipulated by them?
Well, I think one important step is to diversify our news sources. Instead of relying on just one or two outlets, try to get information from a variety of perspectives. Read articles from both, say, liberal and conservative publications, compare how different outlets are covering the same story, and pay attention to the language and the tone they use.
That's a good point. I think it's also important to be aware of our own biases too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We all come to the table with these pre-existing beliefs and opinions, and it's so easy to just gravitate towards information that confirms those beliefs. But if we want to be truly informed, we got to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and consider alternative viewpoints.
Exactly. Critical thinking is essential here. Don't just accept everything you read or hear at face value. Ask questions, do your own research, and try to form your own conclusions based on the evidence.
So it sounds like it all comes down to being active, engaged consumers of information. We can't just passively absorb what's being fed to us. We need to be critical, skeptical, and willing to dig a little deeper.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, in a world of information overload, silence can be just as powerful as noise. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just step back. Take a break from that constant barrage of news and opinions. Give yourself some space to think critically and form your own informed judgments.
Mm-hmm. That's a great takeaway. It is so easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of the 24-hour news cycle, the constant chatter on social media. But it's crucial to remember that we have the power to choose what information we consume and how we react to it.
Well said. And I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into this Tesla vandalism case. As we've seen, it's a story with a lot of layers, a lot of complexities, and it raises these really important questions about the influence of political rhetoric, the power of media framing, and the importance of critical thinking, especially in our increasingly polarized world.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we may not have all the answers, I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
I hope so. And I hope it encourages our listeners to continue exploring these issues, engaging in thoughtful, nuanced conversations about the challenges we face as a society.
Right.
After all, the more informed and engaged we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this complex and, ever-changing world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our soul.